This second part of the module outlines the problems caused by monopoly power. This part also offers some solutions to the problems. Problems with monopoly. So the word monopoly often has a very negative connotation. Well, especially with a bad economy, we often hear people complaining about greedy companies, such as Wall Street, banks, and so on. However, these entities are often not monopolies. Okay, so most important enduring monopolies or near monopolies in the United States rest on government policies. The government support is responsible for fixing agricultural prices above competitive levels, for the exclusive ownership of cable television operating systems in most markets, or for the exclusive franchises of public utilities and radio and TV channels, or for the single postal service, right? So the list goes on and on. Monopolies are often economically inefficient and can make societies worse off. So in other words, the market failure caused by this market power creates a deadweight loss. This comes from the fact that the prices they charge are much higher than the marginal cost, and that output is restricted compared to competitive markets. It also offers fewer choices for consumers and might promote the unhealthy competition called rent seeking. This term rent seeking means the payment to a factor of production in excess of what is required to keep that factor in its present use. So you can think of these like privilege seeking. In the context of monopoly, you can think of licensed doctors, often lobby to keep regulations in place that restrict competition from unlicensed doctors. Patents and copyrights are also special regulations that hamper their competitors. Competitive markets versus monopoly. These two panel diagram compares and contrasts the two different market structures. In panel A, it shows a competitive industry, and panel B is a single monopoly firm. Note that the market demand is downward sloping in both market structures, right? And the way these two demands are drawn seem to have similar price and quantity demanded relationship. In panel A, the market forces of supply and demand determined the quantity produced at QC on the graph and the market price at PC on the graph. Recall also that there are many small firms in this competitive market, and each firm earns zero profits due to the free entry of other firms. So firms are efficient and produce output at the lowest point on their ATC curves, the average total cost curves. So the quantity produced QC is efficient, right? And by the way, at that quantity of QC, price also equals the marginal cost. Because the supply curve is just a summation of all marginal cost curves of all these many small firms. In panel B, the profit-maximizing monopolist will choose to produce the quantity of QM instead of QC and set the price as high as the willingness to pay of the consumers at PM, which is higher than PC. Generally, profits are positive since price is going to be greater than the average total cost at the level of output chosen, QM. Output under monopoly is less than the point at minimum ATC. Therefore, the firm is not economically efficient, and there is some deadweight loss. So in monopoly, prices are higher and output is lower compared to competitive markets. Let's take a look at the deadweight loss of monopoly. The monopolist charges too high of a price and produces too little of the product, so some consumers would who would benefit from a competitive market lose out, right? So since the demand curve or the willingness to pay is greater than the marginal cost between the output levels of QM and QC, society would be better off if output was expanded to QC. But a profit maximizing monopolist will limit output to QM. The result, a deadweight loss equal to the area of the yellow triangle, is inefficient for the society. In one sentence, a monopolist produces less output and charges a higher price than competitive market and create a deadweight loss. With fewer choices or no substitutes, consumers may be forced to pay higher prices for goods and services since they have no option to buy cheaper substitutes. In addition, multi-product monopolies, cable companies for example, may bundle other goods together that you must also buy. This raises prices and profits for the firm and may make consumers buy more goods than they want to. Rent-seeking. Think about this as, spending time, effort, and resources in ways that attempt to gain monopoly or keep existing monopoly power, rather than spending money on making a better product or improving production. They would spend money on lobbyists and lawyers and spend resources defending their monopoly power. This is an economically inefficient use of resources in this market. The firm is attempting to eliminate competition, and this act doesn't benefit consumers. We have learned that monopolies do not produce as much social welfare as competitive markets do. As a result, public policy approaches attempt to address this problem. So the policy solutions include breaking up the monopolist, reducing trade barriers, and regulating markets. The desire of economists to have the state control monopolies has undergone a long cycle. As late as 1890, when the Sherman antitrust law was passed, most economists believed that the only anti-monopoly policy needed was to restrain government's impulse to grant exclusive privileges, such as that given to the British East India Company to trade with India. They thought that other sources of market dominance, such as superior efficiency, should be allowed to operate freely to the benefit of consumers, since consumers would ultimately be protected from excessive prices by potential or actual rivals. So the government has exercised control over monopoly practices since the passage of the Sherman Act in 1890, right? And the task currently falls to the Department of Justice. Standard Oil is one good example. Standard Oil controlled 91% of production and 85% of final sales of oil in the United States in 1904. In 1909, the Department of Justice sued the company for violating the Sherman Act. In 1911, the company was forced to break up into 34 independent companies with different boards of directors. So the biggest two companies were Exxon and Mobil, right? So in 1911, the company had to break up. Example of breaking up the monopolist, another one is AT&T. From 1913 until 1982, AT&T had a monopoly on the delivery of telephone services. As the years passed, however, it became progressively harder for AT&T to defend its position that having a single provider of phone services was good for consumers. In 1982, AT&T was split up into 8 smaller companies after spending over $300 million defending itself from lawsuits and antitrust legislation. Suddenly, AT&T had to compete to survive. Another solution to monopoly is to reduce trade barriers. For monopolists, trade barriers prevent rivals from entering their territory. For example, imagine that Florida could place a tariff on California oranges. For every California orange sold in Florida, the seller would have to pay a fee. Florida orange producers might like this because it would limit competition from California. But California growers would cry out loud and reciprocate with a tariff on Florida oranges, right? So growers in both states would be happy, but consumers would be harmed. For example, if a damaging freeze in Florida depleted the crop, Florida consumers would have to pay more than the demand-driven price for imported oranges from California. If, in contrast, Florida has a bumper crop, the tariff would keep prices artificially high and much of the extra harvest would go to waste. So the Constitution reads, "No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports." Rarely have so few words been more profound. With this simple law in place, states must compete on equal terms. In addition, if we eliminate trade quotas and tariffs, international firms may force domestic producers to become more competitive, which will reduce monopoly power. Solutions to monopoly. More recently, many economists have lost enthusiasm for antitrust policy due to its, objectionable uses. Antitrust laws have prevented many useful mergers, especially vertical ones. A vertical merger is one in which Company A buys another company that supplies A's inputs or sells A's output. So many economists considered price regulation instead of doing this antitrust policy. So in the case of natural monopoly, it is not practical to harness the benefits of competition. Breaking up a natural monopoly would actually be a bad idea, due to economies of scale. There are some firms in which bigger really is better. If the average total cost curve is downward sloping over a very large range of output, it means that a bigger firm can produce output at a lower cost than many smaller firms. While this monopoly may be desirable, right, compared to a peer monopoly, we still want to make sure, right, that the firm doesn't abuse its monopoly power by charging exorbitantly high prices. This is where price regulation comes in. Regulatory solution for natural monopoly. What if there was no regulation? Unregulated monopolist sets MR equals MC and produces QM at the price of PM. Since PM is greater than the average cost of producing QM units at CM, the monopolist earns the profit shown in the green rectangle labeled as profit without regulation. Now, with regulation, when a natural monopoly exists, the government may choose to use the marginal cost pricing rule to generate the greatest welfare for the society. If a firm is regulated, regulators can set price at marginal cost, and the output expands to QR. In this example, since the cost of production is subject to economies of scale, the cost falls from CM to CR. This is a large efficiency improvement. The regulated price PR is lower than the monopolist price PM and production increases. As a result, consumers are better off. But what happens to the monopoly? It loses in the amount of the pink rectangle. This occurs since the average costs under the marginal cost pricing solution CR are higher than the price charged by the regulator at PR.